Welcome to Echoes of the Past, where forgotten American history comes alive. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe now. Let's step back in time and begin the story. Ever wonder how some of the darkest stories in American history never made it into the textbooks? Here's one that'll chill you to the bone. Summer 1863. While cannons thundered at Gettysburg, just 300 miles north, something far more sinister was happening in the quiet hills of Middle Tennessee. 73 people gone, not soldiers, not enslaved men or women escaping in the night. Ordinary folks, hired hands, neighboring families, even people who just asked the wrong questions, vanished without a single trace. No bodies, no funerals, no answers. When federal investigators finally looked into it, what they uncovered was beyond horrifying. A single cotton plantation, hiding a secret that made war itself look almost merciful. The case files, locked away by military order, sealed in Washington for more than a century. And what makes this story truly terrifying isn't just the number of victims, but how precisely they were erased. Belongings logged like warehouse stock, lives dissolved, literally in chemical baths that left no remains for grieving families to bury. Tonight, we're peeling back the whitewashed facade of Rosewood Manor and exposing how Tennessee's most powerful cotton dynasty built its fortune on a foundation of unmarked graves that were never meant to be found. Before we dive into the twisted legacy of Ezekiel Chamberlain and his cursed empire, make sure you're subscribed, because what you're about to hear will turn everything you thought you knew about the graceful world of Southern plantation life upside down. And drop a comment. Where are you watching from? We love hearing from our dark history family, because what we uncovered in those long-buried archives, it'll shake you. Rosewood Manor wasn't just a house. It was a gleaming monument to wealth and power in Rutherford County, Tennessee, just 20 miles southeast of Nashville. Built in 1834 by Josiah Chamberlain, the estate outlasted financial crashes that destroyed others. And by the height of the Civil War, when most plantations were bleeding dry, Rosewood was somehow producing more cotton than ever. Picture it, a 3-story Greek revival mansion, 6 towering Corinthian columns, double-tiered galleries wrapping around its shining white frame, commanding a view of 2,000 acres of some of the richest black soil in the state. Inside, hand-carved Italian marble fireplaces, French crystal chandeliers, mahogany wood aged for 7 years before it was even installed. Ezekiel Chamberlain inherited all of this and more. At 42, he was tall, silver-haired, too early, sharp-eyed, a man who carried himself like true Southern aristocracy. But those who really knew him sensed the cold beneath the charm. His hands, soft like a man of privilege, carried calluses, not from work in the fields, but from things his neighbors couldn't begin to guess. When Union troops rolled into Nashville in February of 1862, plenty of wealthy landowners fled. Ezekiel didn't budge, claimed neutrality. Meanwhile, he quietly cut deals with both sides of the war. He sold cotton to Confederate quartermasters at sky-high prices, then turned around and sold that same cotton to Union forces after raids, getting paid twice on the same load. Audacious, brilliant, ruthless. But that was only the surface. Margaret Chamberlain, Ezekiel's wife, came from old Virginia tobacco money. At 38, her youthful beauty had hardened into something sharp, a presence that commanded fear more than admiration. She ran the household like a military campaign. Every ounce of flour, every candle burned, every drop of molasses recorded in perfect copperplate handwriting. But what those immaculate books didn't capture were the quiet, late-night conversations between husband and wife, planning things no ledger could safely hold. Then there were the twins, Daniel and Samuel, 21 years old, cold, calculating, like their parents, but missing their patience. Daniel, nervous, clever, constantly adjusting his spectacles whenever something dark was brewing. A student of bookkeeping and chemistry before the war, skills that would soon take a gruesome turn. Samuel, the brawler, broad-shouldered, strong, the one who liked getting his hands dirty, sometimes even more than Ezekiel could stomach. By spring of 1862, Tennessee was chaos. Union forces held the cities. Confederates clung to the countryside. Rivers became highways for fortune and ruin. Most plantations had lost their enslaved labor to escape, to enlistment, to seizure, but not Rosewood. Somehow, Rosewood never slowed down. Neighbors whispered about Ezekiel's endless supply of workers, faces hidden under wide-brimmed hats, appearing at dawn, disappearing at dusk, unrecognizable, silent, obedient. The truth was far worse. After Lincoln's preliminary Emancipation Proclamation in September 1862, Ezekiel made a cold decision, one that would damn his family and doom dozens of innocent men and women just trying to survive. He didn't cling to slavery. He adapted. He offered wages to freed black men, to poor white laborers, anyone desperate enough to take the work. They came willingly, and then they disappeared. What happened next would shock even hardened investigators. Stay with us, because the deeper this story goes, the darker it gets. You know how some deals seem almost too good to be true? Here's one that was deadly at the height of the Civil War. While Tennessee burned with uncertainty, Rosewood Manor started offering something unheard of: $2 a day, plus food, and a place to stay. By wartime standards, that was gold. More than most factory men were pulling in over in Nashville or Memphis. But there was a catch. A quiet, dangerous catch that no one noticed until it was far, far too late. The contract locked workers in 2 full years, no leaving early, and the money. It wasn't paid out as they worked. It was held in trust only to be released at the end of their service. Sounded reasonable. Secure labor in chaotic times. But what it really did was trap dozens of desperate souls in a nightmare they couldn't escape. The first crack in the Chamberlains' perfect facade came in November of '62. A widow, Martha Henley, walked into the courthouse at Murfreesboro with trembling hands and a fading photograph. She wanted answers. Her brother, Thomas, a blacksmith, a good man, had lost his shop to union requisition, so he took a job at Rosewood 6 weeks earlier, promising to send word as soon as he got paid. But no letter came, and when Martha rode out there herself, Daniel Chamberlain told her a story that didn't sit right. Thomas, he claimed, had been caught drinking, fired, and sent away without pay. But Martha knew better. Thomas hasn't touched a drop in 7 years, she whispered to Sheriff Coleman Briggs, clutching that daguerreotype like it was life itself. Not since our father died from drink. Thomas swore on Papa's grave he'd never touch whiskey again, and he meant it. He never broke a promise, never missed a day's work in his life. Briggs, a thin man with too much gray for his age, knew the Chamberlains had for decades. He promised to look into it, but something about her story kept gnawing at him. Thomas Henley was known across town as steady, sober, reliable, the kind of man who didn't just vanish, and sure as hell didn't sneak liquor on the job. Still, war changes people, sometimes in ways no one sees coming. Maybe, Briggs thought, losing his shop had broken him. Maybe. That afternoon, the sheriff rode out to Rosewood, and there, waiting on the mansion's grand steps, like he already knew this visit was coming, stood Ezekiel Chamberlain, black suit, leather-bound, ledger in hand. .com. To calm, I expected you. Sheriff, Ezekiel said smoothly, that Virginia drawl still clinging to his words after 30 years in Tennessee. Regrettably, Thomas Henley was unreliable. We discovered him stealing tools and found whiskey in his quarters. I have witnesses, statements, documentation. Briggs flipped through the papers. Everything matched. Signatures from Samuel Chamberlain, Josiah Creek, and a field hand, Moses Washington, swearing they'd caught Thomas drinking behind the cotton gin. The handwriting was clean, dates lined up, too perfect, and yet Briggs felt it, that itch in the gut he'd learned never to ignore. Ezekiel's answers were too rehearsed, his gray eyes too fixed, like a man watching for every flicker of belief or doubt. And then there was the smell, not manure, not sweat, something sharp, chemical, the kind of sting that reminded Briggs of the town tannery, only stronger, nastier, wrong. I hope you understand, Sheriff, Ezekiel said, snapping the ledger closed. Discipline is essential in times like these. Thomas was given every chance. He chose otherwise. Briggs nodded, pocketed the papers, and rode off. But he couldn't shake it. Every instinct he'd honed in 15 years, wearing that badge, screamed the same thing. The Chamberlains were lying, and they were lying about something big. 3 days later, Martha Henley's body surfaced in Stones River. They called it an accident, said the recent rains had made the current fast, treacherous. Her horse grazed nearby, unharmed. No bruises, no obvious foul play, but her handbag was gone, and so was the only photograph of her brother. By winter's end, the quiet and ease spread. James Patterson, a carpenter from Shelbyville, gone. His wife, Sarah, got one letter in January, neat and reassuring, then nothing. When she made the long trip to Rosewood in March, they told her James had abandoned his post, left without a word, even left his tools behind. Then there was Elalani Walsh, young Irish, fleeing poverty in Nashville, hired as a seamstress in January, vanished. Her landlady said she'd left her boarding house smiling, hopeful, with a single carpet bag and a promise to come back for her things soon. She never did. Weeks turned into months, silence, and this was just the beginning. What happened next would pull the mask off Rosewood Manor and reveal just how deep the rot went. Stick with us, because this story isn't done, and the next chapter is even darker. Ever hear of a whole family just vanishing, not running off, not caught in crossfire, just gone as if the earth swallowed them whole? That's exactly what happened in February of 1863. Isaac S. Freeman, a skilled cotton gin mechanic, packed up his wife Ruth and their 2 teenage sons, Jacob and Benjamin. They sold their little farm near Franklin, loaded everything they owned into a single wagon, and headed for Rosewood Manor. They thought they'd found salvation, good wages, steady work, food, a roof over their heads. They were never seen again, and they weren't the first or the last. Every time Sheriff Briggs looked into one of these disappearances, he ran into the same wall. Ezekiel Chamberlain always had paperwork, contracts showing misconduct, claims of theft, stories of drunkenness, or just notes saying the workers abandoned their posts. Every document looked perfect. Every witness sounded believable, and yet not a single person who'd gone missing ever turned up again. Not alive, not dead, nothing. But inside Rosewood Manor, doubt was starting to grow, and it came from the last place anyone would have expected. Josiah Creek, the plantation's head overseer, had worked for the Chamberlains since the place was built. He was a giant of a man, arms like oak branches, a face burned and beaten by 40 years of sun and hard labor. He'd done ugly things in his life, enforced brutal punishments, carried out orders without flinching. But what he was seeing now chilled even him. By early March, Creek noticed the plantation's food stores weren't depleting the way they should have. If there were really 67 workers, like Daniel Chamberlain's records claimed, they'd be burning through supplies a whole lot faster. But Creek's own count, quiet, careful, told a different story. 30-9, that's all he could account for. Where were the other 28? The answer came slowly, like pieces of a nightmare falling into place. Late at night, always, between 2 and 3 in the morning, Creek saw Daniel and Samuel Chamberlain moving through the workers' quarters. They carried lanterns. They weren't alone. 2 pale, gaunt men always walked with them, strangers who didn't belong. They wore laborers' clothes, but their soft hands, their careful movements, these were not farm hands. They carried leather satchels, heavy, metallic, the kind you'd expect from a doctor or a surgeon. And after these midnight visits, by sunrise, somebody from the quarters wouldn't be there anymore. Their cabins would be cleaned out, clothes, tools, everything gone like they'd never existed. On a humid night in April, Creek decided he'd seen enough whispers and shadows. He followed them. He watched, hidden between the cabins, as the brothers slipped into the quarters of Benjamin Carver, a free black man from Memphis. Carver had been asking too many questions, noticed too many faces disappearing. 20 minutes later, Daniel and Samuel emerged, carrying a heavy canvas sack between them in the moonlight. Creek could see it wasn't clothes inside. It was too heavy, too shapeless, and the dark stains, bleeding through the fabric, told their own story. Samuel was breathing hard. Daniel kept scanning the shadows like a man who knows he's being watched, or at least suspects it. Creek trailed them quietly as they made their way to the family cemetery, the manicured resting place of 3 generations of Chamberlain, their marble headstones shining faintly in the night. But they didn't stop there. They pushed deeper into the woods, past the iron fence, past the graves, until torchlight flickered ahead, hidden among the trees behind a massive oak. Creek's heart pounded as he crouched low and watched. There they were, Ezekiel Chamberlain, his 2 sons, and those same pale strangers, all standing over a pit. The brothers lowered the canvas sack inside. One of the strangers uncorked a glass bottle and poured a clear liquid over the contents. That smell hit Creek immediately. Quickklime. The sharp, acrid burn. Sheriff Briggs had noticed weeks earlier, the kind that eats flesh to nothing. Ezekiel stood at the edge of the pit, voice low, but creek caught enough to make his blood run cold. 73 souls to build an empire, each one a brick in the foundation of our dynasty. What we do here tonight ensures our family will prosper long after this war is forgotten. When the grave was filled and disguised, leaves scattered, undergrowth replanted, the group split. Ezekiel headed back toward the house. The sons and the strangers walked toward a large barn. Creek followed. His curiosity wasn't curiosity anymore. It was dread. But he had to know. Through a gap in the wooden siding, he peered inside, and what he saw would haunt him until the day he died. The barn wasn't a barn anymore. It was a factory, a macabre workshop designed to erase human beings. Along one wall sat massive wooden vats filled with that same quicklime solution, bubbling, hungry. This wasn't murder. It was industrialized disappearance. Bodies reduced to nothing. Valuables recovered. Stories written to cover the tracks. The Chamberlains hadn't just killed for money. They'd turned death into a business model, and the night had only begun. Stay with us, because what Creek uncovered next would make even this look tame. Ever wonder what true evil looks like when it's dressed in respectability? When death hides behind perfect paperwork and polite smiles? That's exactly what Josiah Creek had stumbled into, and what he found inside that barn would scar him forever. He pushed closer, heart pounding, and peered through a narrow crack in the wood. Inside wasn't a barn at all. It was a factory, not for cotton, not for livestock, but for death. Huge wooden vats stood in rows, each one filled with a chemical stew, quicklime, the same acrid smell that had haunted every disappearance. Long-handled paddles were used to stir what was inside, while metal screens caught anything that refused to dissolve. And on long wooden tables, piles, neat, organized piles, rings, tools, clothing, bits of lives carefully stripped away and sorted like inventory creaks. Stomach turned as his eyes focused on the familiar. Thomas Henley's leather tool belt, Ellen Walsh's silver locket, the Freeman family's wedding rings, placed side by side in a little wooden box like trinkets from a market stall. In one corner, a furnace glowed, red hot, waiting to melt down gold and silver into clean, untraceable bars, ready for sale. But worse than the piles, worse than the furnace, were the books, ledgers, thick, open, waiting. Daniel Chamberlain's careful handwriting marched across each page. Not a farm record, not crop counts, but names, dates, values. Thomas Henley. November 15th, 1862. Tools and silver watch. $1.47. James Patterson. December 22nd, 1862. Carpenter tools. Gold ring, $89. Ellen Walsh. January 18th, 1863. Sewing supplies. Silver locket, $23. Freeman family. February 8th, 1863. Wagon. Tools, household goods, personal effects, $156. Page after page, minus 73 names, 73 human beings, reduced to numbers, possessions, and profit. Over $4,000 worth of belongings, neatly logged, more than enough to keep the Chamberlain family rich, while other plantations starved through the war. But Creek could see it now. This wasn't desperation. This was design. The Chamberlains weren't panicked farmers turning to crime. They were predators. The plantation wasn't a home or a business. It was bait, a perfectly built trap for people looking for safety, work, and a future. And it had worked again and again. The earliest dates went back to 1861. This had been happening for 2 years, quietly perfected like an industry, a slaughterhouse for the desperate, the pale strangers Creek had seen. Their names were written to Dr. Cornelius Polk and his brother Edgar, Confederate medical men gone rogue after Shiloh, a physician and a chemist, exactly the kind of partners needed to kill without marks and dispose without trace. They handled the dirty work, precise doses of chloroform or morphine, quiet, painless, invisible. But that wasn't all. The family ran ads in Tennessee and Kentucky newspapers. Good wages, safe work, food provided. They went after the vulnerable widows, immigrants, freed slaves with no kin, skilled tradesmen ruined by war. They had allies, 2 crooked boarding houses and labor brokers feeding them names, taking small cuts for sending souls straight into the Chamberlains' hands. It was all there, written in ink, calculated, cold, efficient, and Creek knew this wasn't just murder. This was America's most organized killing machine, hidden in plain sight. But then a sound. His boot pressed down on a loose board, and it cracked like a gunshot. The barn went silent. Footsteps, then a voice, sharp, cutting through the night. "Who's out there?" "Daniel Chamberlain." "Samuel, check the yard. Take the dogs. Don't let whoever it is get away." Creek ran. Branches whipped against his arms. Brambles tore at his clothes as the hounds exploded into the night behind him, barking closer. Then farther, then closer again. A deadly heartbeat chasing him through the dark Tennessee woods. Samuel's voice roared above the chaos. "Find him. Don't lose him." Creek's only edge was knowing every inch of this land, every ditch, every fence, every blind path from decades of toil. But he knew the truth now. They wouldn't stop, not until he was found, and when they did, he'd be entry number 74. Ever wonder how close someone can come to death before the world decides to notice? Josiah Creek found out his frantic sprint through the Tennessee woods ended with a brutal twist, literally. He tripped over a fallen log, tumbled hard into a shallow ravine, and felt his legs snap with a sound that made bile rise in his throat. He lay there, gasping, sweating, pain flooding his body as the sound of hounds grew louder, closer. The Chamberlains' bloodhounds had his scent. Now, human voices, Samuel Chamberlain's deep bark of orders, cut through the night. The higher, sharper tones of the Polk brothers answered back as they fanned out through the trees. "He can't have gone far," Samuel's voice rang out. "The dogs have his trail. There's nowhere to hide. When we find him, we'll make it look like an accident. Maybe a fall from his horse." Then Edgar Polk, nervous, restless. "What if he's already told someone?" A calm, smooth voice joined them. "Ezekiel Chamberlain." Then we widen the cleanup, but I doubt he said a word. "Creeks. If he disappears, no one's going to dig deep enough to threaten what we've built." Creek pressed himself into the cold, wet mud of the ravine, heart pounding so hard he could taste copper in his mouth. His broken leg throbbed with each shallow breath, and above him, men calmly discussed how to erase him like they had 73 others before him. That's when fate stepped in. Corporal William Hayes, Union cavalry scout, had been watching Rosewood Manor for 3 days on orders from Major General William Rose. His mission: track Confederate supply routes. But something about the Chamberlain place had caught his attention. Too many new workers arriving, too many late-night movements, a strange, acrid smell drifting on the wind. When Hayes heard the chaos in the woods, dogs shouting, the heavy rush of a hunt, curiosity won over protocol. He turned his horse toward the noise. That's how he found Creek broken, bloodied, half buried in mud. At first, Hayes thought he'd stumbled upon a runaway slave or a thief, but Creek grabbed his jacket, eyes wide with terror, and whispered, through clenched teeth, "They're killing folks for their belongings." 73 people dead, buried in unmarked graves. You have to stop them before they take any more. And then he told Hayes everything: the vats, the chemicals, the ledgers, the names, the dates, the profits, an entire operation, murder as a business model. Hayes hauled Creek onto his horse, and together they rode for Nashville, Creek half conscious, guiding the soldier with every ounce of strength he had left. At first, Union officers brushed it off, a bitter overseer, a Southern sympathizer trying to smear a loyal plantation owner. But Creek's details were too sharp, too specific, exact. Locations of barns, graves, even what they'd find in the ledgers. Major General Rose couldn't ignore it. If even part of this was true, then Rosewood Manor wasn't just a plantation. It was a private slaughterhouse, a war crime factory operating under everyone's nose. On May 15, 1863, a full company of Union infantry descended on Rosewood Manor. Despite his shattered leg, Creek led them to the barn. What they found stunned even battle-hardened soldiers, who thought they'd seen the worst of humanity. The vats, the sordid piles of belongings, the furnace maps marking 73 graves, each stake numbered to match names in Daniel Chamberlain's ledgers. And those ledgers, horrifyingly detailed, not just names and possessions, but notes, skills, family ties, physical descriptions, cold assessments of who was valuable, who was vulnerable, who could vanish without notice. Early pages described sloppy poisonings and staged accidents. Later ones, surgical, precise. The Polks had turned the killings into quiet science, but the most chilling discovery wasn't the graves, it was the future. In Ezekiel Chamberlain's own elegant handwriting sat a business plan, a roadmap for scaling up the operation after the war. He'd calculated that the chaos of Reconstruction would create perfect conditions for their work. A chance to expand human harvesting on a scale no one could imagine. When Union troops finally moved in to arrest the Chamberlains, to drag this murderous dynasty into daylight, the place was already empty, silent. They were gone. Somebody in town must have tipped them off. They'd ridden out under the cover of darkness, carrying only what would fit on horseback. They left behind a fortune, cotton, livestock, machinery, but also something far more valuable to investigators: proof of a killing business that would stun even men who'd stared down the ugliest parts of Civil War, and the 2 pale men who'd been helping the Chamberlains. Identified at last, Dr. Cornelius Polk and his brother Edgar, Confederate medics who'd deserted after Shiloh, officially missing in action. But Creek's testimony filled in the real story. They hadn't disappeared, they'd been hired, recruited to turn slaughter into a science. 3 days after the raid, Both brothers turned up floating in the Cumberland River, throats slit, tied to rocks. Their silence bought at the edge of a knife, courtesy of the very people they'd helped. Excavating the truth took almost a month. Engineers from the Nashville and Chattanooga Railroad were called in, digging up 73 graves in a field that smelled of quicklime and rain-soaked death. In most pits, only scraps of bone and cloth survived, but it was enough to prove Josiah Creek hadn't lied, enough to give grieving families something, anything, to hold on to. And as the investigation widened, the nightmare only grew. This wasn't some isolated spree. It was a network. Accomplices in Nashville, Memphis, Louisville, even St. Louis boarding house owners, labor brokers, shady publishers, all quietly funneling victims straight into the Chamberlains' hands. For nearly 2 years, they'd turned human lives into cold cash, living like royalty while their neighbors rationed salt and shoes. Federal authorities lit up the South with wanted posters, huge rewards offered, agents chasing whispers as far north as Canada. Rumors flew. Mexico, South America. Some swore they'd seen Ezekiel Chamberlain boarding a ship in Mobile with forged British passports. But the truth, nobody ever nailed it down. Some historians think Confederate soldiers executed them as traitors. Others say Union patrols shot them on sight and buried the bodies quietly. And a few insist the Chamberlains made it out, vanished into Europe or South America, rich enough to buy themselves new names, new lives, clean reputations. Meanwhile, Rosewood Manor itself changed hands. The Union seized it, turned it into a hospital, a house built on blood, now forced to heal. The cotton fields were cut up and handed out to freedmen and white refugees, survivors of a different kind of ruin. But the mansion, it sat there, empty, beautiful, hated, for almost 20 years. No one wanted it. Folks claimed it was haunted, cursed by the 73 whose voices still whispered through the halls. Workers quit mid-ripper, spooked by crashes in empty rooms, by tools falling from steady hands, by a cold weight pressing on their chests at night. Finally, in 1884, the Louisville and Nashville Railroad bought the land. No sentiment, no superstition. They leveled the manor, laid down tracks, and built a switching yard over Tennessee's most elegant slaughterhouse. And now, nothing remains. Nothing but a single metal sign, a historical marker planted in 1963, 100 years after the graves were found. It stands on a busy street in Murfreesboro, unnoticed by drivers hurrying to work. It says simply, "In memory of the victims of Rosewood Manor. Their names are known to God. Most who pass it have no idea what sleeps beneath the asphalt. But a few, a very few, still tell the story of a cotton empire built on unmarked graves. Josiah Creek, the man who broke it open, lived on. He never healed. His legs stayed crooked, every step a reminder of that night in the woods. He worked with the feds, helped them trace names, piece together lives, testify at tribunals that would later shape how we define war crimes. He never married, never had children, rarely spoke of what he'd seen. Neighbors said he carried something in his eyes, a quiet weight, like a man who'd stared too long at the dark and learned it stares back. And maybe that's the part that chills the most, because monsters aren't born with horns and claws. Sometimes they wear silk cravats and offer a handshake. Sometimes they smile over dinner. Sometimes they're the neighbors you'd trust to watch your children. But under the right pressure, greed, war, opportunity, people can become something worse than monsters, something deliberate. What if the story you thought was over? Him lay a sealed envelope addressed to the Tennessee State Historical Society with one request: don't open it until I'm gone. Inside, a confession. A map of Horrors Creek had carried in silence for decades, and it changed everything. Creek's careful handwriting revealed the number everyone thought they knew. 73 victims wasn't the whole story, not even close. The real toll, he wrote, was closer to 100. The extra names, drifters, escaped slaves, men and women no one would come looking for. People who lived at the edges of society, easy to take, easy to erase. And here's the part that chilled even seasoned historians, Creek admitted. He'd suspected something for months before he ever saw the truth. He noticed it in the food. Too much disappearing too fast. In the way certain workers were hired, then quietly gone. But he kept quiet, out of fear, until the night it became impossible to ignore. And just when you think it can't get darker, it does. Creek wrote that he'd heard whispers, rumors, that Rosewood wasn't the only place doing this. That other plantations had turned wartime chaos into private slaughterhouses. No one ever proved it. No one ever dug deep enough to know for sure. But the possibility, it still hangs there, heavy. The Chamberlain case remains one of the most calculated killing enterprises in American history, a cold reminder that the worst crimes aren't always committed by wild-eyed madmen, but by calm, educated, business-minded killers who see people not as neighbors, but as numbers. Think about it. While the South was bleeding, the Chamberlains built a quiet empire of death, a machine that promised honest work and delivered only graves. And what made it monstrous wasn't just the scale, it was the method: ledgers, logistics, target selection, witness elimination, murder as management. Ezekiel Chamberlain, the mastermind, charming, persuasive, ruthless. Margaret, the organizer, keeping death on schedule as smoothly as she once ran her household. And the Pokey brothers, trained physicians. Years, their business scaling quietly like any other profitable venture. They nearly got away with it. Their disappearance, their likely flight with stolen wealth, proves how hard it can be to bring such predators to justice. And yet, from this darkness came law. The investigation and trials set early precedents, a legal framework for chasing organized murder for profit, and later, war crimes. Investigators learned to look past chaos and see the machinery of criminal enterprise hiding. They were ordinary folks, laborers, widows, refugees, who'd lost everything to war and came looking for work, only to find death waiting in a ledger's empty line. And that may be the most. While the world was counting battlefield dead, rarely screams, it whispers, it smiles, it signs contracts, it shakes hands. The Chamberlains weren't madmen, they were businessmen who made murder a line item. And as Creek's final words warn us, civilization is only as safe as our willingness to watch for those who would turn humanity into profit. So what do you think? Did the Chamberlains escape justice, or was disappearing into the world its own kind of punishment? Could other plantations have hidden the same horrors, now lost forever to history? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Share this with someone who loves the shadows of history. The most terrifying monsters look exactly like everyone else.